The air in Port Harbor, Maine, was thick with a salty, humid tension, a palpable unease that mirrored the churning, leaden grey of the Atlantic. For weeks, a tropical depression had been a distant, forgettable whisper on the National Weather Service's broadcasts, something most of the old salts had learned to tune out. This was New England, after all. Storms were a part of life, a seasonal rite of passage that separated the true mariners from the tourists. But today felt different. The wind, which usually carried the playful, sharp scent of brine and pine, now howled with a low, mournful groan, rattling the windows of weathered clapboard houses and whipping the white-capped waves into a frenzy of foam. The seagulls, typically a constant, noisy presence, were eerily absent, a silent portent that only those who truly understood the sea could feel. Liam, a single father in his late 30s, felt it in his bones. A fisherman by trade, he had spent his entire life on these waters, inheriting his love for the ocean and the sea wind from his own father. He knew their moods, their subtle shifts from calm to a deadly chaos. Today, the sea was not just angry, it was enraged. He was on the docks, his worn hands meticulously checking and rechecking the moorings on his boat, his face grim with a determination that bordered on desperation. His 8-year-old daughter, Lily, was back at home with his mother, safe for now, but Liam couldn't shake the feeling of dread, a cold hand tightening around his heart. He had been poring over the satellite imagery and storm models, not the dismissive chatter of his fellow fishermen, and the warnings were dire. Unprecedented storm surge, coastal flooding of historic proportions, and the phrase that echoed in his mind, life-threatening wave events. He tried to warn them. He walked the length of the Maine pier, his voice cutting through the wind's rising shriek. "We need to get our boats out of here. The surge is coming. It's bigger than anything we've ever seen. It's not just rain. It's a wall of water." His words were met with skepticism and an almost hostile indifference. Old man Harrison, a grizzled captain with a face like sun-baked leather and a deep-seated distrust of modern meteorology, just spat a stream of tobacco juice into the swirling water. "Relax, Liam. You worry too much. It's just a bit of wind. We've seen 1,000 storms like this and lived to tell the tale." Mike, a younger fisherman whom Liam had mentored for years, just shrugged, his confidence born of inexperience. "The tide's not even that high yet. We've got time. Besides, where are we supposed to go?" The sentiment was echoed by most of the others, their pride and long-held traditions blinding them to the unprecedented danger. A large tour boat, the Ocean Queen, sat docked with a full afternoon schedule ahead, its gleaming white hull a stark contrast to the rough-and-tumble fishing vessels. The captain, a slick, self-assured man named Finn, just waved Liam off with a condescending smile. "Our radar's clear. We've got tourists to entertain. No need to panic." Liam felt a cold wave of frustration and fear wash over him. He was a quiet man, not given to dramatic displays, and his urgent warnings felt like they were falling on deaf ears, swallowed by a toxic mix of stubbornness and hubris. He saw them going about their usual routine, checking traps, mending nets, their casual movements a jarring counterpoint to the growing violence of the weather. They were completely unprepared for the catastrophe he knew was looming. Ignoring their indifference, Liam went back to his boat, his heart pounding in his chest like a war drum. He was fighting a losing battle to convince them, but he had to do what he could for himself and for Lily. He pulled extra lines from his locker, doubling up the moorings, his mind flashing to Lily's bright, trusting face. He knew he couldn't control the storm, but he could control his own preparedness. He worked with a feverish intensity, the wind now a constant deafening roar, the first drops of a heavy, blinding rain beginning to fall. The water level in the harbor was rising at an alarming rate, and a new, more sinister sound began to emerge. The groaning of stressed wood and the sharp clatter of loose gear breaking apart. A few people started to look nervous, their bravado cracking under the storm's assault. But it was too late. The sky turned a sickly, bruised purple, and the full, unrestrained fury of the storm was upon them. The moment the wave hit, it was no longer a storm. It was a disaster of biblical proportions. It wasn't the kind of wave that breaks gently and rolls in with the tide. It was a solid, monstrous wall of water, a roaring leviathan rising from the depths, propelled by an immense and unnatural force. It was a sheer 60-foot column of violent ocean, black and foaming, a living entity of immense power. The sound it made was not a simple crash, but a terrifying, deep-bellied rumble, like the world itself was being torn apart at the seams. It blotted out the sky, a moving mountain of liquid fury. From the deck of the Sea Wind, a vessel he had meticulously secured, Liam watched in a state of frozen horror as the wave swallowed the end of the pier hole. The elegant tour boat, the Ocean Queen, was torn from its moorings like a child's toy. It was lifted, suspended for a horrifying moment, and then smashed against the unyielding concrete seawall with a sickening groan of metal on stone. The screams of its passengers were a sudden, nightmarish chorus lost in the sound of splintering wood and groaning metal. Mike's boat, the Sea Serpent, was a victim of the same brute force, lifted high into the air and then slammed down, splintering into 1,000 pieces of debris that were now deadly projectiles. Wood, metal, buoys and fishing gear flew through the air, driven by the hurricane-force winds. Liam was thrown against the side of his own boat as the wave passed over them, the water rising to a level he had never imagined possible. The docks, the very foundation of their lives, were being ripped apart with a horrifying ease. He saw Old Man Harrison's small fishing boat, the Wanderer, capsize, its name a tragic irony now. For a terrifying moment, he thought he saw the old man trapped underneath, his face a fleeting glimpse of pure terror. The harbour, a place of order and routine, was now a swirling vortex of wreckage, despair, and chaos. He had to act. He didn't have time to process the devastation, the loss, or the sheer magnitude of the tragedy. He saw a young woman clinging desperately to a piece of driftwood, her face pale with terror, her clothes shredded by the storm. The powerful current was pulling her inexorably towards a jumble of jagged pilings, a certain death. Without a moment's hesitation, Liam grabbed a life preserver, a weathered orange ring that had been a part of his boat for years. With all his strength, he threw it towards her. It was a long shot, a near impossible aim in the swirling wind and rain, but she managed to catch it, her hands raw and bleeding from desperately clinging to the wood. He shouted instructions, his voice hoarse, telling her to hold on, that he was coming for her. His next focus was the wrecked Ocean Queen. He could see people, dozens of them, trapped on the half-sunken wreck. The captain, Finn, was shouting orders that were lost in the roar of the wind and waves, his face a mask of abject terror and regret. The ship was listing badly, its hull gashed open by the concrete wall, water pouring into the lower decks. Liam knew they had to get off, and fast, before it sank completely. Maneuvering his own boat became an act of pure will, a brutal physical fight against the powerful currents and swirling debris. His years of experience, of understanding the rhythm of the sea, kept the sea wind from being swallowed by the chaos. He managed to get close enough to the wreck to shout, his voice now a raw cry, "Jump! One at a time! We'll get you!" Finn, the same man who had dismissed him just an hour earlier, now looked at him with a mixture of terror and overwhelming awe. He began to organize the terrified passengers, pushing them toward the side of the sinking ship, his arrogance replaced by a frantic need to survive. Liam's small fishing boat, a vessel of simple utility, became a makeshift rescue ark in the heart of the storm. He pulled soaking, terrified people from the frothing water, his arms burning with the effort, his body screaming in protest. Every moment was a struggle, a fight against the immense, indifferent power of the storm, but he kept going. He kept thinking of Lily, of what he would tell her if he didn't come home. He had to save them, not for glory or recognition, but because it was the only thing a man could do. By the time the storm finally passed and the relentless driving rain turned to a steady, weary drizzle, Port Harbor was utterly unrecognizable. The sky, a bruised and turbulent mess of grey and purple, began to clear, and a weak, golden sun began to peek through, casting a long, mournful light on a scene of total, heartbreaking devastation. The docks were gone, replaced by a tangled, splintered mess of wood, rope, and twisted metal. Boats, once the proud, hard-working lifeblood of the town, were now overturned husks and shattered wreckage scattered along the shoreline like discarded toys. The familiar landscape was a wasteland of ruin. But amid the ruin, there was life. Liam, his body aching and his mind numb with exhaustion, had managed to rescue nearly 24 people from the wreck of the Ocean Queen. They huddled together on the small, less damaged section of the main pier, wrapped in blankets that others from the town had brought down from their homes. Their faces were a mosaic of shock, gratitude, and profound relief. Their eyes, once dismissive, were now fixed on Liam, the quiet man they had mocked and ignored just hours before. He was a hero in a town that had forgotten what one looked like. Vin, the captain, his clothes soaked and torn, his face pale and streaked with dirt, walked over to him. His earlier bravado was completely gone, replaced by a deep-seated humility. He extended a hand, his voice shaky with emotion. "Liam, I don't know what to say. We should have listened. Thank you. You saved us all." Liam, exhausted to his core, just nodded, accepting the apology without a hint of resentment. He didn't hold a grudge. He understood the stubborn pride of men who had lived their lives on the sea and the blind spot it could create. "We did what we had to do," he said simply, his voice a rasp. "We're all in this together now." The immediate aftermath was a blur of activity. Emergency services arrived, setting up a command center and tending to the injured. People who had been safe in their homes, who had ridden out the storm in fear, came out to help, their shock giving way to a quiet, determined resolve. The community was in ruins, but they were not broken. They were a unified force driven by a common purpose. In the days and weeks that followed, the true rebuilding began. The story of Liam's warnings and his heroic actions spread through the town, then to the national news. He wasn't a hero in the classic superhuman sense, but a man who had listened to his gut, trusted his knowledge, and acted with courage when others wouldn't. The community, humbled and united by the disaster, rallied around him. They started a fund to rebuild not just his boat, the Seawind, which had miraculously survived the worst of the storm largely intact, thanks to his preparations, but to help every fisherman who had lost their vessel. The town wanted to help the man who had helped them, to honor his foresight and bravery. One sunny afternoon, a month after the disaster, Liam stood on what was left of the docks with his daughter Lily. They were holding hands, looking out at the calm blue sea, a stark contrast to the violence they had witnessed. The harbor was still a mess of construction and cleanup, but there was a new energy, a new spirit of cooperation and respect. He pointed to the small, rising framework of a new, stronger pier being built. "See that, sweetheart?" he said, his voice soft, but filled with a quiet strength. "It's all about listening to the weather, to the sea, and to each other, and to your own heart when it tells you something is wrong." Lily squeezed his hand, her small fingers wrapping tightly around his. "You listened, Daddy, and you saved them all." He smiled, a tired but genuine smile that reached his eyes. The town was a long way from being what it was, but the disaster had washed away more than just the docks and boats. It had washed away the old stubbornness, the casual dismissal of others' concerns, and the isolation that had crept into their lives. It had replaced it with a newfound respect, a profound sense of community, and the quiet, undeniable truth that sometimes the most ordinary person, armed with nothing but a clear mind and an open heart, can be the one to save everyone.